It's good to have you all together. Well, I am so excited to be moderating this conversation today. My name is Destiny Magna. I'm the Programs and Outreach Manager at Churches for Middle East Peace, and I'm joined today with three incredible panelists who I'll introduce in just a second for our webinar called Who is My Neighbor? How Christians Can Challenge Islamophobia and Advocate for Just Peace in Times of Fear. When we first started imagining this webinar, it was now several months ago, around the release of Reverend Doctors Anna and Michael's new book, which I'm sure you'll hear more about. And we couldn't have imagined the escalations of violence that we've seen in the subsequent months that make this conversation even more urgent. So in the wake of the atrocities we've borne witness to in Gaza over the past more than 2.5 years, what Palestinians refer to as the ongoing Nakba, fear in our own communities, and now escalations across the Middle East in Iran, Lebanon, Israel, and more. Now is a more important time than ever for Christians, particularly those of us in the US, to really grapple with some of our theologies and ideologies that are sowing violence and asking ourselves what solidarity means. And in this conversation, we'll be in particular thinking about what solidarity looks like with our Arab and Muslim neighbors. So this event is being co-sponsored by the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. You can read more about them on our registration page, but they're an incredible organization that is a coalition of religious denominations, faith-based organizations committed to ending anti-Muslim hatred, and all three of our panelists have been involved with them in various capacities. As we start off today, we're going to hear some opening remarks from each of our three panelists. We'll go into some conversation, and I'll invite any of you who have burning questions to submit them to us using the Q&A feature, and we'll have a chance to do audience Q&A later in our panel. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist for her opening remarks. Our first panelist is Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner, who's a Catholic theologian, an author, and a professor whose work has centered on Muslim-Christian relations, particularly Muslim-Catholic relations, interreligious dialogue, Islamophobia, and Israel-Palestine. So Jordan, over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Destiny, and CMEP for having me. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then give some other remarks. I am going to share some slides, just some images to sort of ground my brief comments. So give me one moment to do that. Are you all able to see that? Wonderful. Great. So as Destiny mentioned, I'm involved with the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign as a scholar in residence, but I'm also involved with CMEP's Catholic Advisory Council. This is a group of us Catholics from across the United States dedicated to bringing CMEP's work into Catholic communities and helping engage Catholics on the issue of Israel-Palestine, educating them on the realities faced by our friends and siblings in faith in the Holy Land, and then helping Catholics to push for a just peace in Israel-Palestine. So I just want to draw your attention to the Catholic Advisory Council. We have our own sub-listserv through CMEP that I welcome people to sign up for. But to piggyback off of Destiny's point, I think she's right that this conversation around Islamophobia and Israel-Palestine and what we as Christians sort of owe our Muslim friends and neighbors really couldn't be more timely. I think just in the last several weeks, we've seen, I think, the largest and most rapid surge in Islamophobia that we've seen in years. And I really feel kind of transported in a way back to 2015, 2016, 2017, the last presidential campaign season and the first years of the first Trump administration, where Islamophobia really was something that was a political tool, and that was kind of defining of that political moment. So I just want to talk a little bit about how I understand anti-Muslim prejudice and discrimination, and then talk about some contemporary manifestations of it here in the United States, but then also how it's connected to events abroad and the issues that CMEP works on. So I understand Islamophobia as not simply being fear of Islam or fear of Muslims. Islamophobia is, as I write about it in my book and my own work, prejudice and discrimination that targets people based on a perceived association with Islam and Muslims. So that's kind of a mouthful, but for me, it has a few different components. One, Islamophobia is how people think and feel about Muslims. So things like anti-Muslim attitudes, um, anti-Muslim sort of feelings or bias, but then also how Muslims are treated in concrete ways. So that could be everything from interpersonal relationships and or like hate crimes, all the way to government policies and things like that. Um, Islamophobia can be expressed in overt and kind of blatant ways, but it can also be very subtle and even unintentional and latent at times. Islamophobia certainly affects Muslims, but it also affects people who are not Muslim, but who are perceived to be Muslim or who are kind of lumped together with Muslims. And I think oftentimes Arabs and Palestinians sort of fall under that category. And then finally, I think Islamophobia can be understood as a form of racism in a sense, because Muslims are kind of assumed to have these inherent negative qualities and to also look a certain way, despite being a very diverse religious group in terms of race and ethnicity. But there's all these stereotypes that are ascribed to Muslims and kind of assumed Muslims are assumed to have them. Things like Muslims are inherently violent, the idea of Muslims being oppressive to women, tyrannical, wanting to impose their way of life on others. And so these are the stereotypes that often get leveled towards Muslims and have been leveled towards actually lots of different either immigrant groups or religious minority groups in the United States throughout history. I think historically, but especially in this moment, Islamophobia is often connected to anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian sentiment. I think a lot of, again, these stereotypes dog all three of these communities because people conflate these identities. But I also think that it's very important in this current moment, especially that we don't reduce the dynamics here in the US to an issue of Islamophobia versus anti-Semitism. Because I think so often the way that Israel-Palestine is framed in terms of like what are its reverberations here in the US, it's the sense that Jews are Islamophobic and Muslims are anti-Semitic, and we kind of pit the two communities against each other, and then kind of assume that Christians are taking one side or the other, or maybe even worse, kind of we're absolved of any kind of involvement or implication in any of this. And I also think that framing things in this way can sometimes strip out the politics of the whole thing, and make us kind of forget that Israel-Palestine is not this perennial religious conflict, but it's rather a geopolitical situation that often invokes religion or has, dynamics that are connected to religious identity and things like that. So we can talk more about that, but I just want to run through a couple other things in the time that I have left that I just think are important for us to kind of keep in mind as we think about this issue right now. Of course, we're in the midst of the war in Iran and in the broader Middle East. One of the things that we have found, and I've found in my work for years, is that when the U.S. is involved militarily abroad, negative stereotypes about Muslims surge in the United States. In part, sort of as just I don't want to say a natural thing that would happen, but, because people are seeing Muslims in a negative light on their TV screens and on their social media, but also because I think stereotypes about Muslims are peddled to sort of manufacture some consent around these wars abroad. We are also, in the wake of and still kind of in the unfolding of the genocide and the Israel's war in Gaza. And, we can talk more about how Islamophobia plays into how Palestinians are viewed and things like that. But I don't think it's surprising in a sense that we're seeing a surge in broader Islamophobia right now in the wake of this violence in Gaza. But we're also seeing a lot of issues with Islamophobia domestically, with Republican politicians in particular targeting Muslims and using anti-Muslim rhetoric. We have examples of Randy Fine from Florida, Andy Ogles from Tennessee, and others who are saying things like Muslims don't belong in this country, or other dehumanizing statements about Muslims. And we at Shoulder to Shoulder have been doing some work to try to call for some accountability on this. But this has become a dynamic. This is also connected to this resurgence of political rhetoric around what's, Sharia law, this idea that this sort of manufactured problem that politicians will use to say, oh, Muslims are trying to impose their way of life, their legal system here in the US, and I'm the best candidate to sort of push back against this problem. So it's this dynamic that we saw back in the 2010s, a political playbook that was quite successful back then, that politicians are using again in a midterm year. And these sorts of things have reverberations. There have been hate crimes that have occurred against Muslims in the United States in recent months. Muslim American civil rights organizations have also been targeted. And there's also been cases of, and Anna's actually written pretty extensively about this, cases of Christians who are harassing Muslims praying in public and kind of invoking centuries old tropes, kind of almost like theologically tinged critiques of Islam in harassing Muslims today. And so these are some of the dynamics that we're facing and that are facing our Muslim friends and siblings in faith. So I'm going to stop there and let my colleagues jump in and share their opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Grateful for your remarks and eager for the conversation to come. Next, I'm going to introduce our duo of panelists, which will be splitting up the next 7 minutes. We have Reverend Doctors Anna Piela and Reverend Dr. Michael Woolf, who are a married clergy couple who founded Challenging Islamophobia together, Chicagoland and Interfaith Solidarity Initiative, and are also the co-authors of the recent book, Challenging Islamophobia and the Church Liturgical Tools for Justice, which I'll link in the chat. So Anna and Michael, over to you. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Thanks for having us. We're really grateful to be here. So I think Jordan just covered some of the stuff that we want to talk about. But one of the things that we really want to situate is this present context and the war in Iran and sort of how that is the outplaying of Christian nationalism, and sort of the foreign policy of Christian nationalism that we see. And we see a lot of support from that from religious leaders who talk about things in apocalyptic terms. And some of the things that you see is people like Franklin Graham, right, who are in the White House's orbit and probably one of the most prominent faith advisors to the White House right now, who is called this basically the fulfillment of a prophecy, that's citing stuff like in Revelation, as well as has thanked the president for bringing liberation to Iran and is looking forward to what God is going to do. Activists like Sean Vogt who are on YouTube, who are talking about how this is going to open the doors for God's action in the Middle East and perhaps usher in the end times. You have all sorts of folks who are marshaling really Christian theology in support of this war, and it's really common. The most common thing that you see if you look around and you look at sermons sort of after February 28th is you're going to see lines like quoted from Scripture, when all these things happen, look up, right? This sort of sense that everything is culminating right now, and the war in Iran is a holy and blessed thing because it is in fulfillment with the end times playbook. And so what we see is foreign policy in many ways and theology are meshing together in really dangerous ways. And because we live in a Christian nationalist state, the person who's approving the bombs that are being dropped right now has a Deus Vult tattoo, God wills it, the line from the Crusades. He wrote a book about the Crusades in which he said it was a really good thing and that we ought to look to the Crusades as a manual. And he also shouted, sort of infamously, kill all Muslims in a bar over and over and over and over, which they knew about when they confirmed him, but it didn't seem to make much of a difference. We also have all sorts of things that are happening that are feeding into that sort of Christian nationalism. The foreign policy is part of it, but it's also back home, right? So we've also got Trump is going after the head of the snake, which is Islam. So this is being coded as a conflict that is between the West and Islam. Sometimes that looks like a conflict between Christianity and Islam, and sometimes our government wants to pretend like it's a secular state of some kind and rational, as opposed to Iran, which is going to be this sort of religious. It's called zealots, or it's called religious extremists. All this sort of rhetoric really gets pulled out. And Anya, I think you're going to take the next one.
Oh, actually, well, I suppose I can cover these. So I just want to pick up on something that Jordan mentioned in her presentation, that military conflicts abroad that involve Muslims in some way, have ripples at home. And so here we've got a graph that illustrates the number of Islamophobic posts on X, formerly Twitter, including reposts, from January 1st to February 19th. So it's kind of, we've got a few spikes here, but I just wanted to show you the full graph, which includes this last spike at the end. That's the first week after the war started. And within that week, there were 25,000 Islamophobic posts on X, and that is represented by this. So actually, according to this, would be 70,000. So perhaps it was 25,000 original ones, and this is plus the reposts. And this study was done by Center for Study of Hate. And it just illustrates how, this rhetoric, political rhetoric, aggressive foreign policy, and then, are connected, and then how there's this sort of other part of the cycle, which is it comes back from, the war and the rhetoric translate into Islamophobic kind of incidents at home. Because here we've got just the social media, but of course, we've seen from previous conflicts, post 9/11, I think the increase in anti-Muslim incidents within the year was up by 1,600%. Then we had there was, of course, then the war in Iraq. That's kind of kept an elevated number of hate crimes. Syria, that around 2015 to 2018, ISIS was in the headlines all the time. And of course, the genocide in Gaza, and Israel's direct involvement, but the United States' indirect involvement in that. Within the first month of the beginning of that genocide, we had one child stabbed here in Plainfield, Illinois, Wadi al-Fayumi. He was 5 years old, and he was stabbed to death by a radicalized Christian. You can't really describe it in any other way. His mother was almost murdered. She barely survived. There was also a group of 3 students who were wearing keffiyehs, and they were all shot. One of them was left paraplegic. And then there was also less publicized case of a little girl who was almost drowned by a woman in Texas. And based on what the woman was yelling, it was clearly, the anti-Palestinian sort of sentiment that drove her to try to drown that girl. And so, we've got, Destiny said at the beginning, we couldn't have imagined that this war would happen just like within a month of this webinar here. But at the same time, we could have, because there's a very regular involvement of the United States in the Middle East. This is not new. This is just another leaf from the same playbook. Another sort of excursion done under the guise of civilization, democracy, removing a undemocratic regime, when everybody knows that, in fact, this is all about oil. Not the first time. But let's come back to the United States. Here is a graph that I've got that is done based on a study done by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And that institution has created a research tool called the Islamophobia Index. It's based on answers of any respondent to 5 Islamophobic stereotypes. And basically, those answers are translated into a number on the scale from 0 to 100. And so here we've got 3 different Christian groups. White evangelicals, who are at the top, 45, and also the increase was the highest by 15 points since 2022. So this is the last 3 years. Catholics, 12 points from 28 to 40, and then Protestants from, I think it was 23 to 30, so 7 points. The general American population is illustrated by the purple line, and that ended up at 33. So we can see that some major Christian groups in the United States have sort of increased their Islamophobia index based on those responses, which were, by the way, representative. There was a representative sample, and so we when we show this slide, we ask our audience, why do you think Islamophobia rose so sharply since 2022? And why did it rise so sharply among Christians? It didn't rise like that among Jewish people, for example, because it's just a rise of from 17 to 19, so 2 points. So what's going on? And I mean, people usually correctly assign this rise in Islamophobia to their anti-Muslim rhetoric coming from even the top political offices, and the genocide in Palestine. So and this is this is really not a secret, but we like to have people think about it and actually articulate it on their own. Michael, would you like to say a little more about what we did with the book, why we wrote the book?
So one of the things that we did in the book is that we're trying to sort of address the home front of this, right? So because these geopolitical and foreign policy endeavors, like we talk about, they circle back here in some really profound ways. And so one of the ways that we can really tackle that is through using our churches, where we still have a lot of people who go to church and a lot of people who can learn about Islam and can come to see it as a pure tradition, and can learn how and develop the skills how to fight anti-Muslim hate as part of their Christian call to discipleship. So that's really what we really want to do, is to equip to do work here on the home front, and it's all linked, right? So whenever we are reducing Islamophobia here, and when we're tackling the core issues around Islamophobia, whenever we're resisting Christian nationalism in particular, we are also affecting how much support, for instance, there is for a war in Iran. And so I think that these are all linked, and it's a really important time to do this work now. And so that's why we're really delighted to be here, and delighted that you're here for this webinar.
Thank you all. This was so informative and startling. And one of the things that I'm thinking about coming out of all 3 of your remarks is, on the one hand, I think from what you've laid out, there's this very obvious call that we as Christians, as followers of Christ, need to confront these Islamophobic tropes and rhetoric, because so many communities are enabling them and doubling down on them. And I'm wondering if we could go around and also answer the question, what do you think our scriptural call, or what does the gospel call us towards when it comes to loving our Muslim neighbors? And how could you frame this in that way as well? Whoever would like to start.
Sure. I mean, I think that the gospel is always relational. It's always sort of challenging us not to, like J.D. Vance articulated, that basically the gospel is about loving your family first, and then it goes out in concentric circles. And this is actually exactly what the gospel is not about. That's a very narrow view of the gospel. It's like exactly the opposite of what the gospel says, actually, The gospel talks about how we are supposed to love people who are our neighbor, and that includes a whole swath of people who do not share our religion. And when we take a look at something like the story of the Good Samaritan, for instance, it's someone who we don't think we have anything in common with. It's people are all included in that neighbor category. And that love is supposed to be radical. It's supposed to be transgressive. It's supposed to cut against societal norms. And there's always this sort of impulse, I think, to sort of capture it, to like wrap it in a box and make it neat and tidy. And that's sort of what J.D. Vance was sort of trying to do with that sort of, and the Pope rightfully sort of called him out on that and said that like that's actually not what the gospel says in any way, shape, or form. And I think that that's really important, is that we have rich resources in Scripture, right, that talk about what it's like to love across boundaries. And the more we can sort of tap into that and see that not just as sort of a peripheral thing, that Jesus wasn't sort of kidding about it, I think the more we can tap into that, then we can sort of awaken Christians to this call that loving across boundaries is a core part of what we're supposed to be doing in the world. And I think that those boundaries include religion, right? You know, so we're supposed to love our Muslim neighbors. And part of that, of course, is not hating them. Part of that is standing in solidarity with them and making sure that when hate comes their way, that we're actually going to be there with them and the first people to say, that's not acceptable in our society, and it's not acceptable using our holy text as well, which I think a lot of people want to turn to Christianity these days and use to foment hate, which is not new, but it has some new connotations right now.
Anna, Jordan, do you want to add anything to that? Jordan, go ahead.
Sure. So like the good Catholic, I'm going to lean more on tradition than scripture, going with the stereotype of Catholics not reading our Bibles. But one of the resources that I've drawn on in my work for addressing Islamophobia, but also addressing the situation in Israel-Palestine, is what's called Catholic social teaching. And I want to also let folks know about a new resource that Julie Schumacher-Cohen, my co-author, and I are coming out with later this year, applying these principles of Catholic social teaching to the situation in Israel-Palestine. But in my previous work, I've also applied these to the issue of Islamophobia. And basically, CST is this body of Catholic teaching documents, papal encyclicals, statements from bishops' conferences, things like that, that address lots of different social issues, whether economic justice, environmental issues, racism, what have you. But one of the things that I've tried to do is also apply these to interreligious relationships too. I think sometimes we just kind of treat other religions through the rubric of dialogue, but I think these social justice principles are also really important. And so what those are the inherent dignity of every human person, what we call the preferential option for the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized, basically saying, okay, because we care about the human dignity of every person, we're going to focus our efforts on those who are suffering the most. This concept of the common good, this idea that we're not just going to take care of our own communities, it's not just Catholics first or Christians first, but rather we're going to care about the well-being of all, and that the measure of a society and the measure of the success of a society is whether everyone is doing well, not just one segment. And then there's also these principles of solidarity and subsidiarity, this idea that, yes, we need to do sort of this broad-based activism, we need to engage government institutions, things like that, but also we need to be on guard for where there is government overreach and try to solve problems also at the most local level possible. And this is why the work of Anna and Michael is so crucial, because they're really working in the local community, in Chicago, and we see these sorts of efforts all over the country. I also just want to uplift, we've talked about all of these really sort of negative trends and episodes that we're seeing right now, but I also just want to share a couple images from some recent efforts that have been done just within the last couple of weeks to express our solidarity as people of faith, those of us who are not Muslim, with our Muslim friends amid rising Islamophobia. And most of these pictures are from an interreligious, multi-faith prayer and witness on Capitol Hill last week, where we at Shoulder to Shoulder, along with Interfaith Alliance, Muslim Public Affairs Council, and a bunch of other organizations, did a prayer that we're going to be sharing more publicly, expressing our solidarity with Muslims. But then we went to Capitol Hill to talk to folks in Speaker Johnson's office and also in Representative Andy Ogle's office to say that this anti-Muslim rhetoric that members of Congress have been voicing is contrary to American values, and it does not align with our commitment to religious freedom for all. And so it was a really beautiful interfaith witness. And we had a lot of Christian and Jewish leaders who drew from our faith traditions to say that it's important that we don't scapegoat our Muslim neighbors, but rather stand with them in the face of all this.
Yeah, I'm actually going to bite because there's one thing that I think needs to be mentioned very briefly, that there's a really long history of Islamophobia in the church. It's really it's been around for as long as Islam has been around. Because as soon as Islam emerged, there were Christian apologetics created by monks, then universities, and a lot of those tropes that were created really early on were then used during the Crusades, when they were, used to actually sacralize the Crusades. The Pope said, this is your land, and wrest it from the wicked race, meaning Muslims who lived there, and I assume Jews, because Jews lived there too. And so we had, these barbaric crusades, and I could talk a lot about colonialism, but just fast forward to today. Literally, the things that these politicians are saying are over 1,000 years old, and that's why I think Christians have a moral responsibility to tackle this, because we are kind of complicit in this unless we confront it.
Thank you all. Something that's come up a bit in the chat, but I also had on one of the questions I wanted to ask is, we've heard you talk about Christian nationalism. Something in our circles, particularly working on Israel-Palestine, that comes up all the time is Christian Zionism. So my question for the three of you is, how do you see these two concepts relating to one another and to this broad Islamophobic rhetoric countering work that we're doing at the same time?
I would say that, well, it's not my idea. It's a writer called Piela from Harvard Divinity School. She wrote an article in which she said, Christian Zionism is the foreign policy of Christian nationalism. And I think that's a really, really acute and really sharp observation. These two things go hand in hand. And I am also noticing in the interfaith world that Christian nationalism is used much more often as a concept, as something threatening that we should be fighting, as an ideology that is rooted in Christianity, therefore we have to fight it. But there's very little said about Christian Zionism in the mainstream liberal democratic circles. That seems to be still on the fringe. It is not a part of the mainstream vocabulary.
That's helpful. I love that. Christian Zionism is the foreign policy of Christian nationalism. I'll repeat it again. And Michael or Jordan, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so I actually want to tell a story from when I lived in Jordan. Years ago, I studied abroad in Jordan, then lived there on a Fulbright research grant after college. And the reason I went back to do the research was because the first time I lived there, I was with my host family, my Christian Jordanian Christian host family, watching a lot of Christian television programming there. And what I learned very quickly is that there were entire Christian TV channels that spent hours and hours of programming demonizing Muslims and Islam. And this really caught me off guard, because I had come to Jordan, which is very proud of being, a society that values its Christian and Muslim bonds and holds itself up as this model of interreligious cooperation and coexistence in the Middle East. And yet there were these TV channels that, fully in the Arabic language. It was, produced in Arabic, that were dedicated to bashing Islam. And I thought, this is so weird. Where is this coming from, and why is this happening? And the more research that I did, and I dug into it, a lot of these programs and entire channels were funded by Christian organizations in the United States that had a Christian Zionist agenda. and saw, fermenting distrust between Christians and Muslims as advancing part of this, goal of getting to the end times, and again, fermenting conflict to usher in the coming of Christ. And we know all this whole narrative of a certain form of Christian Zionism that is espoused by so many here in the United States. And so one, I just found it really surprising and problematic, and also just very sad, because what it made me realize is that, kind of American Christian Zionist ideologies were not simply affecting Americans here or people in Israel, Palestine, but really in the broader Middle East, and fermenting distrust among communities that have historically had good bonds. And so, that's just kind of another portion of this to highlight. But, unfortunately, I want to say that I do think that the work of addressing Islamophobia does kind of chip away at American foreign policy and other Christian, ideologies and theologies that seek to dominate or dehumanize. But we can't only addressing Islamophobia is, I think, only part of that.
Yeah, and in our work at Churches for Middle East Peace, one of our priority areas has been the sustainability of the church in the Holy Land. And that's, of course, absolutely crucial. The Christian communities are shrinking and disappearing in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And yet we also have this addition that what's happening to the Christian Palestinian populations is also happening to their Muslim neighbors. And keeping that exceptionalism as part of our consciousness, I think, is critical when we're talking about this organizing work. And to that end, one of the things I was really fascinated by, Anna and Michael, in your recent book is the idea of holy envy, which you borrow from Chrysler Stendhal. And so I'll read a short quote, and then I have a question for you. You say, in essence, countering Islamophobia is more than just issuing statements of condemnation. Those statements are certainly welcome. It requires cultivating this holy envy. And so what does that look like in practice? And how can it uniquely be applied in Christian communities?
Yeah, so holy envy, like you said, came from this Lutheran bishop in the 1980s named Chrysler Stendhal, who was a dean of Harvard Divinity School. And it was later picked up by Barbara Brown Taylor in like a very, very, very popular book called Holy Envy. But it's just this idea that in interfaith relationships, in sort of coming to know people of other traditions, we're going to see things that we're going to wish were incorporated in our own practice or in our own spirituality, our own traditions. We're going to see resources that we didn't necessarily experience as being available in our own, and that we develop this sort of holy envy. So with our Muslim neighbors, it might be around something like prayer or fasting, or it might be around just how those values are lived out and talked about. We definitely experience holy envy for how it helped us think about our prayer life, for instance, in a different way. But this sort of holy envy, when we open ourselves to these relationships, it allows us also to dive deeper into our own spirituality and to learn more. And this is a really powerful experience. So many of the people that we talk to, I think they really act like God is a very jealous lover and does not want you to experience in any way, shape, or form any other religious tradition, and that God is going to be mad if you do. This is a really dangerous sort of idea. It keeps people apart. It makes people suspicious of interfaith sort of dialogue and exchanges. But I think that what we've really found in our personal lives, and Anna can talk more if she wants, but in our prayer lives and everything, has been that when we develop this holy envy, when we have these encounters with people from other religious traditions, it makes us dive deeper into our own faith to find these resources, to try to cultivate these sort of sensibilities or these disciplines that we have within our faith. And so this can be like a really powerful way for people to engage with other faiths without also feeling like it's hurting their faith, because all that's doing is continuing your spiritual journey, and it's making you a better Christian in so many ways, this sort of engagement and this sort of dialogue.
I'll just add one thing, because I think it's really, really important. Do not read scriptures of other traditions disingenuously. or in other words, read them as generously as you read your own. And so, when you start, if you start to read the Quran, it's not about the spicy verses in there. It's about the whole book, and it has to be read holistically. It's also really good to know something about the history of Islam to understand the connection between the social context and the verses. So yeah, I hear Christians talk a lot about how Christianity is the religion of peace, how Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and Islam is the religion of war. But honestly, you could find in both scriptures, you could find verses that support both positions. So it's not just the spicy verses that really define what the religion is.
Yeah, I mean, we as Christians, we're very practiced at ignoring the stuff we don't like and then trying to find all the stuff that we don't like in other scriptures. So Paul Farmer sort of like developed or popularized this idea of a hermeneutic of generosity. And I think that like this hermeneutic of generosity, interpreting scripture from a generous place, a charitable place, that's the sort of work like churches ought to be doing, helping people to interpret from a charitable place. And also a complex place with some nuance, right? So one of the things that allows all this sort of Zionism and Christian Zionism to take some form is reading something like Revelation and then being really confident that you actually know anything that's going on, as opposed to it just being, wow, a very rich and interesting text that has baffled people for thousands of years, and there's unlikely to be one person who actually sort of knows what is being talked about in that text, sort of leaving some gray area, leaving some things that are mysterious that we don't know and we don't understand. That sort of practice is something that we can do in churches. We can teach people how to do that, to be okay with ambiguity, for instance. The more we do that sort of work, I think it undercuts a lot of the sort of certainty agenda that we have that leads us into these foreign policy ideas, that feeds Christian nationalism, that lets us hate other people. I think that's work churches can do, and we ought to be doing it.
I can tell that Michael and I went to the same divinity school. We have similar reference points here, which I love. And the last thing, Jordan, you wrote this beautiful article about Lent and Ramadan happening at the same time this year. Wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what that conflation looked like. Of course, our Muslim siblings just celebrated Eid, but how you're reflecting on that going into Holy Week in our tradition.
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's as you rightly point out, for the first time in I think hundreds of years, Lent and Ramadan began on the same day this year, which was really special. And it, I think, was a great opportunity for interfaith events between Christians and Muslims. I participated in many of them. But I think for our Muslim friends, it was, celebrated under a pall, in certain ways, with a lot of really horrible things going on, not just here in the United States targeting Muslims, but also abroad. And so I think it's important just that we be aware of that as Christians. But also, one of the things that I've been thinking about in recent days too is that I think, for us, Lent is often a penitential season, right? We're leading up to this commemoration of Jesus's passion and death and resurrection. So there's sort of ultimate joy at the end, but like the season itself is meant to be often kind of penitential and somber. Ramadan is actually quite joyful. And despite the fact, people I think have this stereotype of, oh, this, strict religious practice that Muslims undertake, so it must be a penitential time like Lent. No, actually, it's Muslims' favorite time of year, and it's a really joyful time and a moment of connection with God and with the community. And so, I know that we at Shoulder to Shoulder were uplifting and promoting a lot of the interfaith iftars that were happening around the country, including ones that Anna and Michael were involved in Chicago. And there were over 100 of them, at least, around the country, people getting together, learning about one another, and I think probably getting a taste of the kind of holy envy that Michael was talking about. So things like that are a bright spot and are just ever more important in a time like this.
Thank you. I'm going to take some questions. We've got a couple in the Q&A, a couple in the chat, so I'm going to go back and forth. But the first one I see, Jordan, you said you would field, and then the others can feel free to add. But Gil asks, is Sharia law an agenda? Is it something Western countries should be wary of? Is there any legitimacy in this at all?
So I would say the short answer is no. American Muslims are not seeking to impose their religious law on the rest of us. I think there's this misconception among Americans as to what Sharia law even is. I think they imagine that this is like, a code of law, like in a book that Muslims have, and that they're going to sort of, administer in kind of a heavy-handed way through, courts or legislation or what have you. No, Sharia law literally means the way or the path, and it's this idea that God has a will for how life should be and how we should help one another and live our lives. And it's Muslims' job to discern what that is and figure that out. And Muslims have been doing that for the entirety of their religious history, drawing on the Quran, drawing on the Sunnah, the practice of the Prophet, and kind of manifested in this discipline called fiqh or jurisprudence. This idea of, okay, we need to figure out how to do our inheritance. We need to figure out what it means to get, how to get married, or what our prayer practices are supposed to be, those sorts of things. And so when Muslims are talk about Sharia, this is not just about the kinds of things that we think of Americans when we hear the word law. This is just like how you live your life as a good Muslim. And so it's a huge problem when American politicians, one, sort of let American kind of imaginations and fear run wild as to what Sharia law might be, and then feed that further and say, oh, look at Sharia, look at how horrible it is. I'm going to be the one to sort of, combat it or tamp it down. And what's also really dangerous is, you'll have people, I mean, this goes back now 10 years, Newt Gingrich saying, oh, we should ban Sharia compliant Muslims from the United States. Well, any Muslim is going to say that they want to follow God's way or God's law. I mean, I remember when I lived in Jordan going to mass one day, and there was one of the opening prayers after the opening song, and the word Sharia was used in the prayer. This is a Catholic mass in the Arabic language. Where we were saying, help us God to follow your Sharia, your will. I mean, it just kind of gives you this sense of how the word is actually used and what it means. And so I think it's really important that we as Americans understand that the current, political campaigns that are foregrounding Sharia as this threat are doing the same thing and using the same playbook as we've talked about that people have against Catholic immigrants, Jews, people of other faiths and ethnic backgrounds over time, Mormons. I mean, casting religious minorities as a threat, and leveling the same stereotypes against them. And then also, when Muslims do want to sort of engage their faith tradition and figuring out how to live their lives, it's not different from Jews drawing on, halakha, Jewish legal tradition, or even Catholics like looking to canon law, things like that. So I think, all of this, shouldn't have to be explained. Like Muslims shouldn't have to be explaining themselves like, no, we're not a threat. But it goes to show how deep the politicizing of this fear has gone.
If I could just like add one brief thing, like the real danger about like theocratic ideas is not coming from the Muslim community in this country. Like the danger of us actually having like religious law in any way shaping our national lives is coming from Christian nationalists. And these are the same people who want to point to and make a fear mongering sort of thing about Sharia is it's one of these things that it's a line that we've heard often, but every accusation is a confession. And I think that like in this, it's really true.
Yeah, it's like your theocracy bad, my theocracy good. It's just that. I wanted to add one a really useful comparison. I think I came across somewhere that the loosely equivalent to Sharia law in Christianity, we could say maybe canon law. In Judaism, halakha. So imagine now that there is a similar kind of witches hunt targeting canon law and halakha and Beit Din courts. And, it just sounds crazy. But at the same time, it is normalized that we can talk and debate Sharia law. And so, like, I encourage everybody to think, why is it so crazy and sort of incongruous to think about the two other types of religious law and not this one? Because that answer is really important.
Yeah, we're actually both Baptists. So one of the things I was talking to a Muslim friend is funny. This is just brief. We were talking to him about this or whatever, and he was like, do you have any like sort of ways that you decide things? And like in Baptist, we have church discipline, right? You know, that's like it's not used often anymore, but it's a huge part of the tradition that people would actually take it to basically a court, and the elders would decide on a matter. It was a big deal. And he was like, congratulations, you have Sharia. You know, and I was like, yeah. And it's like that. Yeah, I think that's really true. Most religious traditions have some this is part of their tradition. It's just been sensationalized and been really, I think, cultivating fear. A lot of people are very afraid of this. It's been very well funded and well messaged, and that's always very scary when you're thinking about where the money's coming from and who's really benefiting from this and who's putting a lot of money behind it.
And one last thing. So I have to say this. David Yerushalmi is one of the architects of this legislation, and he was once in a New York Times interview asked about this, and he said that the point of this whole campaign is not to get every state to adopt anti-Sharia laws. The point is to get everybody talking about it. So it's very heuristic in that sense.
It's great. Another question we've gotten from the audience is, given rhetoric surrounding U.S. foreign policy issues related to ISIS, Osama bin Laden, 9/11, Afghanistan, how do we educate the general public on what Islam actually is? We'll put that in quotes, as opposed to the rhetoric that we as Americans, I think this person is referencing, have gotten. And I'll also frame the question as, what does it mean for Christians to be religiously literate when we're engaging with Islam?
Yeah, so I'm a scholar of the sanctuary movement, right? And so I think about this in parallel. During the 1980s, people were not getting from their news sources what was really happening in Central America. And so the sanctuary movement operated as a network of religious organizations that were hearing directly from those affected. So from refugees and asylum seekers who were in this country and were saying, this is what actually is happening in El Salvador. This is actually what's happening in Guatemala. And so they basically formed an alternative news source in so many ways. And many people got their news and actually understood what was going on from these religious organizations, from houses of worship. I think that we're probably not going to get a lot of the messages that we need from mainstream media. So we have to develop alternative sources for getting that. And one of the places that is time honored are churches, right? I mean, we have an opportunity to talk to people, inform them as ethical subjects all the time. It's such a rich resource and such a rich opportunity. And the more churches sort of take upon themselves developing sort of religious literacy, understanding Islam as a pure tradition, helping people, average people in the pews, right? Not just the pastor, not just like religious leaders, but not people who had the privilege to go to seminary, but actually sort of talking to people about what this tradition is. We can really unlock some of that power. I think that there still exists a lot of power to be able to do that. It's just about how do we get more people to sort of take this on. And that's preaching about it, right? That's talking about it, that's writing about it, that's Bible studies about it, that's all these sorts of different ways. But we can form an alternative sort of informational source for people. And I think that there's real promise there.
If I can add, Michael and I were asking the same question, and there was not a simple answer, and that's why we wrote our book. So I'm sorry for blowing my own trumpet, but yes, we brought a book that basically takes you by the hand, and there's a primer on Islam, there's a primer on Islamophobia, and then what can be done within the church.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Anna and Michael have said. I think learning Islam from Muslims is so important. I think one of the stereotypes that I hear a lot in Catholic circles about Islam is, oh, Muslims believe in a God who is a master and is utterly transcendent and can't have a personal relationship with people, whereas we Christians, know God on a personal level. It's this, sort of father-child relationship, and that's better. You can't retain that contrast if you've ever talked to Muslims at length about their spiritual life. Muslims have a very close personal relationship with God, despite not having a theology of the incarnation or the doctrine of the Trinity. And that's actually really destabilizing for Christians, because we see the things that for us make us who we are doctrinally and theologically. Say, well, Muslims don't have that, and yet they still don't they still have this close relationship with God. This their prayers are not to no one. This is the God that we also believe in, right? And so I think learning Islam from Muslims and asking them what is your spiritual life like? What is your relationship with God like is so powerful. And then, obviously there are plenty of us non-Muslims who also teach about the tradition, that I hope do so in good faith and try to teach the tradition in a way that our Muslim friends would understand. But there are unfortunately a lot of Christians who don't. And, going back to this idea of writing the books that you feel like your community needs. I mean, I wrote my first book, Finding Jesus Among Muslims, because a lot of the Catholic books about Islam that were being read and sold in places like the National Basilica Bookstore in Washington, D.C., were by known Islamophobes who are also creating this whole anti-Sharia, all this fear-mongering about Sharia, or we're behind the Ground Zero Mosque controversy and things like that. And unfortunately, Catholics who were, in really good faith, picking up this book, Inside Islam from the Basilica Bookstore, don't realize that there is an agenda here, and someone is making a lot of money making Muslims look bad, and honestly feeding into certain political agendas and things like that. And so I think that hermeneutic of generosity is so important. And I would say even more than reading the Quran itself, get to know Muslims and their tradition first, because we're going to bring to any text the stereotypes and the biases that we have. We're going to read negative stuff into those texts if we don't have a background of who these people are and why this text is important to them. So that's just a little bit of what I would suggest.
Thank you all. We got one more question anecdote. I'll pose it together and also give you each the opportunity, if you have any closing remarks, anything you didn't get to say yet, or final messages you'd like to leave this really engaged audience with. And so this person says they feel like they've learned a lot from Christians in Palestine about how Christians and Muslims can live together in tolerance and forgiveness, particularly as they each suffer under occupation. Why we as Christians in America learn from the Palestinian church in this practice, and what closing words do you have to leave us with?
Well, I think the first thing that Christians in America could do is to read critically and with attention all the letters issued by various churches in Palestine appealing to the world, the global Christianity, to basically just take an interest in what's going on there. So I would say that would be the first step, to get an interest in what's going on. And like Jordan said before, we're not just what's affecting Christians in Palestine, but what affects all Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, I think the work of CMEP and so many others elevates not just the voices of Palestinian Christians, but all Palestinians. And I do think that even the reality of Palestinian Christians surprises a lot of American Christians. They don't know that they exist. And then to realize that they are living alongside their Muslim neighbors and friends, experiencing the same situation of occupation and genocide, is really surprising. Now, of course, Christians and Muslims in Palestine have different theologies and different, it's obviously there are these differences that we all have in terms of religion, and yet there is still a bond and a solidarity in the face of the social and societal challenges that exist. And it's not to say that our various religious groups don't have our challenges in these relationships, but it's very important, I think, for Americans to understand the solidarity that exists across religious lines. And I think another thing I'd want to bring up too. And this gets to the Abrahamic question that has been coming up in the chat too, of all of our traditions that in some way reference trace our lineage back to Abraham, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others. There are so many of us that I think from various religious backgrounds who find ourselves advocating for um, the same things in the Holy Land and in Palestine and Israel. A just peace for Palestinians and Israelis, an end to the genocide, humanitarian aid, release of hostages. I think sometimes it's framed as, again, this conflict that pits the religious groups against each other. But what I actually see is people from various religious traditions actually aligning on the same moral values. And there's plenty of people from our religious traditions who also have very different values and who advance those in different ways, whether they, hold very powerful political positions or whether they're ordinary people. And so I think it's just so important to lean into the interreligious bonds that we have with those the many people who share, our values around peace and justice for all.
Yeah, and we're talking about Palestine as this sort of almost exceptional case study of peaceful sort of coexistence of Muslims and Christians. But I think it's a similar situation in India. And somebody mentioned Hindutva here in the comments. And so, yeah, Christians and Muslims, at least based on what I've heard from Indian Christians, actually get on pretty well because they're both targeted by Hindu nationalists.
Yeah, I think with more time looking at the global case studies beyond our American context and all of this, but the ways that both anti-Muslim rhetoric is emerging around the world, how it connects with all of this, maybe we'll have to do a follow-up part 2 to this series with you all sometime. Michael, any final words from you?
No, I just think that this conversation and continue to have the conversation is really important. And I don't think that, I think there's so much that we can do within our limited spheres. But, it's really important to do what we can and to continue to use our tradition, or our tradition uses us. And so I think that the more that we are active in using our tradition and deploying it towards love and towards truth, towards reconciliation, towards all these things that we hold dear and many other traditions also hold dear, I think that it's really important for our witness as Christians right now.
Thanks so much, all of you, for being with us. A couple of upcoming events from Churches for Middle East Peace. We have a prayer vigil based on the A Time for Peace statement, which is an interfaith statement signed by rabbis, imams, and Christian leaders, including our own executive director, the Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon, condemning and calling for an end to violence in Iran and across the Middle East on Wednesday next week. We also are doing a webinar on freedom of movement and checkpoints in the West Bank with Delia Kumsia, who's a human rights activist and lawyer, on Friday. It's going to be really great. And then finally, if you are in the DC area or feel called to travel to Washington, DC, we invite you to join us for the Joint Christian Advocacy Summit in May 5th through 7th in DC. We're going to be at the historic Shiloh Baptist Church and have an opportunity to hear from a variety of leaders who are engaged around justice work in Palestine, Israel, and across the Middle East. So I hope you'll join us, and thank you again to Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner, Reverend Dr. Anna Piela, and Reverend Dr. Michael Woolf for being with us, sharing your expertise. I hope you read more of what they've written, their books and articles and beyond, and we thank them for sharing their wisdom with us today.
Thank you
For having us.
Thank you so much.
Good to be together. Thanks, everyone.